Racism in the Consulting Room, Myth or Reality? Nazone Msiebel Ph.D. and Hilary Brown Ph.D. Part 2. Curry's 1964 thesis. Curry had argued 1964a, 1964b, that race was such a definitive marker of otherness in American society of the 1950s and 1960s that when a white patient was faced with a black therapist, an additional layer of projections came into play that blocked the normal transference between patient and therapist. He framed these by referring back to the world of myth and archetype. These are projections that cannot be screened out by the analyst's usual strategy of resisting self-disclosure. Because race is obvious, alongside gender, and is clearly so salient that it defines a large part of the interaction, both parties understanding that there is a racial hierarchy operating but usually pretending that this is not so. Our emotional responses in the consulting room are bound to contain these reverberations, and they have to be managed in the interests of the patient, whether black or white. Heavy, 1992, had argued along similar lines in relation to disability, describing how a disabled person's visible vulnerabilities draw projections from the fearful non-disabled until disabled people become dustbins for disavowal of unwanted elements of human experience. But between black and white, this projection goes beyond an individual process of disowning vulnerable or split-off parts of oneself because it is suffused with both conscious and unconscious meanings and associations absorbed as part of one's enculturation. Ride, 2009, p. 22. Moreover, although Curry fought shy of commenting on the treatment of black people in psychoanalytic theory, the psychoanalytic establishment had not only remained silent but to some extent perpetuated these myths through their own writings. Lowe, 2006, pp. 46-47. Msiebel, 2007b, p. 35, has addressed the implicit, and sometimes explicit, racism manifest in the writing of both Freud and Jung, noting that even founding fathers are men of their times. He cites, for example, the way that Freud expressed surprise at the taboo on incest in African culture. As if this confronted the prevalent racist construct that black races were savages who lived as primitive cannibals with uncontrollable sexual drives. In contrast, we might infer, to other more civilized races, Freud, 1913, p. 133, cited in Msiebel, 2007b, p. 14. Freud's priority had been the pursuance of scientific respectability, leading him to present his ideas as absolutes, rather than as culturally specific constructs. He maintained this focus despite his racially motivated exclusion from the medical establishment of his day and the growing anti-Semitism he experienced. Jung, 1994, referred to this as Freud's swinging reductionism, whether born of ethnocentrism or of more widespread ignorance, p. 110. So these inequalities, as Curry, 1964a, saw them, constituted important, but little examined, dynamic economic theoretical factors that motivated symbolic processes in the patient's mind, p. 547, and they had not been helpfully addressed in psychoanalytic theory from the outset. Curry, 1964a, gave 3 layers of explanation for these dynamics: archaic, mythologic images, neurotic distortions, racial biases and prejudices, and socially acceptable patterns of interracial interaction. p. 553. He chose not to make explicit conscious prejudices, devaluing beliefs, or racial hatred that patients brought into the therapeutic space, but focused instead on the unconscious, less articulated material that lurked below the surface. And he tried to nudge this into consciousness by referring back to mythology with its ubiquitous otherness and binary thinking, citing the frequent themes that light and darkness, black and white are complementary and inseparably related in some type of dynamic tension or equilibrium, p. 548. To black is accorded darkness, sleep, death, the devil, and evil. White gets illumination, light, and awareness, but these cannot exist without these complements, p. 548. Curry, 1946a, noted that magic was tied to the underworld and unconsciousness, and hence attributed to black people, whereas white was related to the orderly rational progression of life, p. 548. Other writers have noted, counterintuitively, that these associations occur across cultures. See Ride, 2009, pp. 68-70, see Richards, 1997, p. 6 for an alternative view. Constructs are always defined in relation to their polarities, with the result that, as Curry, 1964a, noted, black people are always conceived of in counterpoint, especially to white upper-class men, along a range of continua, including their supposed inferiority, badness, and emotional abandon, p. 553. Since then, theorists of race have continued to challenge the mechanisms by which, and the extent to which, black people are constructed as other in limiting and damaging ways, see, e.g., Jung, 1994, or Frankenberg, 1997, and to explore how polarization and splitting operate as the mechanisms by which this otherness is manufactured and maintained. Casting groups in the role of other. Curry. 1964a. p. 552. Named these dynamics of otherness in the therapy room as a set of reciprocal responses to race, and Frankenberg described how patterns of relating, which in different modalities might be theorized in terms of object relations, reciprocal roles, schemas, patterns of attachment, or constructs, are hammered out interactively within the prevailing power structure. She showed how these roles and the mythologies surrounding them were co-constructed, complementary, and binary at a societal, as well as at an interpersonal, level. Frankenberg, 1997, p. 12, see also Ryle, 1978, 1995. In his other role as the editor of Dust, a black literary magazine, Curry, 1964a, was quoted as saying that, "It is almost as if you cannot write about being black without doing it in terms of your relationship to whitey. And when it all goes down, black-white may be that deeply related, for whitey cannot define himself as being white without using the reference point of black," quoted in Keller, 1969, p. 37. But white people do keep trying to deny the connection. Theorists from a range of disciplines share the insight that one marker of dominance, whether as individuals or as nations, is that it allows the privileged group to forget that their position has been forged in relation to the less advantaged other, in this way. This connection is actively disowned at many levels. For example, at the level of city governments in the United Kingdom, Bristol and Liverpool are built on the wealth of the slave trade, the profits of which have percolated down through generations, capitalizing businesses and enriching particular families, but this has only recently been made explicit. Beckford, 2004, and black people continue to be portrayed as the undeserving recipients of these cities' wealth, not as the originators of it. Ride, 2009, describes how this denial is portrayed as taking a neutral stance, as if white people could opt out of having a racial identity. p. 39. Freed from the recognition of this bond, the privileged can act as if they are legitimated representatives of, and reference points for, humanity as a whole, and regard themselves as everyman against which a range of differentnesses and inferiorities can be measured. This has been described as the unmarked dominant posing as universal position, Sandoval, 1997, p. 102, after Barth's, and is the means whereby the definers get to consider their experiences as typical, and their successes, self-made. Samuels, 2001, describes this perspective as a kind of papal balcony from which to survey the universe, p. 36. In this way, whiteness has become integral to the standards by which identity, confidence, humanity, gender, knowledge and academic values are constructed. Frankenberg, 1997, p. 18. What these dynamics obscure is the fact that to be this somebody, white people leave black people to occupy what Martin Luther King described as a degenerating sense of nobodiness, quoted in Siebel, 2007 b. p. 10, and that this is clearly a reciprocal role. Moreover, white people and their organizations are disproportionately backed up by economic privileges and sanctions, so that black people are forced into roles that placate and defer, and are more likely to be penalized for challenges or defiance. These reciprocal positions are sometimes negatively perceived to be childlike, passive, or manipulative, see Malinowski, 1961, but when power is inequitably invested in one party to an exchange, it is easy for there to be subterfuge and deception, disguise, and demurring. In this way power and privilege are lived with, denied, diffused, mocked, or obfuscated. This may be construed as a false or proxy self, Lego and Thompson, 1997, when it is in fact a self intent on surviving and one that is adaptive to the needs of the situation and the necessity of keeping the interaction in play. In a context of extreme inequality there will be reciprocity without the possibility of equivalence. The other side of this coin is, as Altman, 1995, describes, a situation where a white therapist may inadvertently reinforce such roles in order to feel a sense of security and usefulness in an effective and dominant position. p. 77. Theorists exploring other forms of differentness have arrived at similar models to explain how otherness is created and policed in ways that serve the dominant race, class, or gender and maintain their illusion that the values against which they measure themselves are universal and uncontested. Simone de Beauvoir elaborated this model of difference in relation to women in her 1949 book The Second Sex. Disability theorists such as Oliver, 1996, and Finkelstein, 1997, developed the same model in relation to disability. Brown and Smith, 1989, explored the links between these and the way that social movements such as normalization would founder if they did not acknowledge both poles of these binary relationships. Altman, 1995, applies the same analysis to class and argues that at a deeper level these categories are interchangeable, simply different surface manifestations of the process whereby a denigrated or demonized or simply disowned other is created. p. 74. These polarizations are sometimes accidentally illuminated by unconscious role reversals whereby white people, when they are challenged, assume that they are the persecuted ones, or switch into victim mode, as for example occurred when Nick Griffin, the leader of the racist UK British National Party, spoke for the first time on mainstream British television in October 2009, BBC, 2009b. Having defended his association with a prominent member of the Ku Klux Klan on the grounds that the KKK was really a non-violent organization, he later complained that the challenging audience had acted as a lynch mob in relation to him. Oppressive categorizing is also shown up by the self-aware and ironic labeling that disadvantaged groups apply to themselves when they take back epithets that others have burdened them with. In a defiant positioning of themselves as cripples with attitude, or queers, or by using the N-word in mockery of those who used it and meant it. Switches, such as these, attempt to break the stranglehold of this binary mode of thinking by drawing attention to it. These assertions perform a new narrative. Speedy, 2008, p. 47, that both echoes and exposes dominant ways of seeing the world and stand as testimony to the creativity and resilience of those labeled when they do the naming rather than allowing themselves to be caught in the processes that create others of them. For the same reason, self-segregation is different from exclusion. Speedy, 2008, p. 17, cites Bird, 2004, who advocates escaping from the binaries and exploring instead the meanings that these categories have in the spaces in between them. This is what needs to happen in therapy because when unspoken, these norms cannot be played with in these ways, they simply lurk in the shadows. But while binary thinking limits, it does not necessarily preclude warm alliances or helpful interactions. One would think that these would start to undo stereotypes and generalizations. But Curry, 1964a, noted that as white people start to see black people as human, they stop seeing them as black and start to co-opt them. He mentioned one patient who wrote, after their therapy had concluded, that, the longer I worked with you, the whiter you became. p. 551. Donald Woods, 1976, a committed white anti-apartheid campaigner, articulated a similar paradox in his writing about the black consciousness movement as it was epitomized by Steve Biko. He wrote, "The movement's adherents were impressively different from most blacks one encountered. They walked taller, were more confident, at ease and articulate. Ironically for purveyors of black consciousness, their blackness was the easiest thing to forget about them. This was particularly so in Steve Biko's case in that his personality and philosophy transcended matters of race and color." Emphasis added. This position has no mirror image. It is unlikely that a black person becoming close to a white person would describe them as more black. The process at work seems to be that the supposedly exceptional black person literally steps out of the white person's stereotype. And in becoming an individual can no longer be subsumed as one of them, so in binary terms has to be included as one of us. Even on Inauguration Day, Ben Bradley, former editor of the Washington Post, when prompted to comment on the historical significance of Obama's election as the first black president of the United States, replied, "Well, I don't think of him as black. When I look at him I don't see a black man." BBC, 2009a. Thus stereotypes survive at the expense of real people, exceptions are dismissed on the grounds that they prove the rule, when what they actually do is fly in the face of it. Binary thinking. Curry, 1964a, speaking in his chosen, and we hypothesize safe, idiom retold the ancient myths in Greek and Roman legend that embody this binary thinking, and traced its tenacity in our shared mental constructs. So how did he see these archetypes getting played out in the therapeutic alliance? According to Curry, firstly, the patient endows the therapist with characteristics and powers that the therapist does not in fact possess, and secondly, the patient then begins to respond to these characteristics as if the therapist actually possessed them. p. 551, thereby eliciting and setting in motion the reciprocal set of object relations. But as Curry points out, all this is irrational, the attributing and responding, a process of mythologizing felt meanings and externalizing them, p. 551. He argued in another paper, Curry, 1964b, that this went beyond normal transference reactions that denote an irrational and infantile attribution of characteristics to another person. Because, when complex symbolic processes, fantasies, fears, and counterphobic reactions are motivated by characteristics the other person does possess such as black skin, such responses are not transference reactions. Rather they are residuals of fairy tales, folk tales and children's stories that deal with darkness, bogeyman, badness, and evil. p. 134. So, Curry, 1964a, thought that patients were responding on the basis of a mythic or symbolic elaboration upon the meanings extractable from the emotionally laden sign and symbol, Negro. Sick, and that these meanings have extremely archaic, unconscious roots, p. 553. By formulating these responses as archaic, it is as if he perceived the negative meanings of blackness to be too entrenched and pervasive to be kept out of the therapeutic relationship, where they would inevitably skew and undermine the transference. See Richards, 1997, pp. 5-6, for a discussion of this position. These meanings are even embedded in our language, where one can blacken a person's name or denigrate them. But Speedy, 2008, declares herself uncomfortable with these culturally fixed notions of archetypal stories, saying instead that it can be useful to explore the way narratives are performed within the dominant discourses of their cultural or social milieu, or are habitual narratives that are well rehearsed, or appear as more local or personal narratives that are peculiar to circumstances and life spaces, and or as alternative, emergent narratives constructed in the moment. P. 46. Raggat, 2007. Talks about these narratives in terms of good and bad stories in opposing relationships, in that difference is not only noticed as diversity, but encrypted alongside, and in terms of, dominant discourses that ascribe superiority/inferiority to others in line with prevailing structural disadvantage and cultural constructs. P. 364. So at specific points in time, we see racist beliefs being hijacked or orchestrated by governments and used to bolster specific class/economic interests. When personal hostilities are legitimized and or magnified in pervasive public discourse, they seem prone to tip into extremes of persecution, pogroms, expulsions, and genocides. As Msiebel, 2007b, notes, in apartheid South Africa, black people were not just other, but hated and, we could add, hounded other. P. 17. Explicitly racist discourse both elicits and condones cruelty and sadism and was apartheid's modus operandi, so shocking that, in relation to one case, Krog, 1998, asked in disbelief, how could we lose our humanity like that? What kind of person, what kind of human being keeps another's hand in a fruit jar on his desk? P. 67. Individualist ethics and political neutrality are inadequate in the face of such extreme splitting. As Speedy, 2008, reminds her readers, the myth of neutrality represents the taking up of a position, in itself. P. 30. Similarly, Dawes, 1992, while acknowledging the usual reticence about self-disclosure in therapy, argued, in the context of racial oppression in apartheid South Africa, that an explicitly principled stance was needed, in that, the therapeutic process has to become politicized in an overt sense. The general rule of neutrality in therapy could not be maintained as far as the political aspect was concerned, and was abandoned for the benefit of the person who needed help. P. 85. Altman, 1995, concurs, asserting that a psychoanalysis that does not address these issues makes a statement of indifference to social issues or of collusion with the established order. P. 75. This echoes Barthes's critique of neither-norism, in which he argues that neutrality supports the status quo because an individual who take this position no longer has to choose between contending realities but only to endorse what already is. Under the influence of neither-norism, one can appear to take higher moral ground and make no commitment to move in any alternative direction. This seeming neutrality encourages an inflexibility of being, however, that supports the dominant rather than some other moral or political order. Barthes, quoted in Sandoval, 1997, p. 93. Hence, neutrality is all it takes to produce and sustain institutional racism. Rules, models, and practices continue to be applied impartially and neutrally even when they have the inadvertent outcome of excluding black people or of failing to name and address issues of race. But despite these outcomes, neutrality allows biased practices to run on uncritically and without reflexivity. Msiebel, 2007b, p. 18, until, as Fernando, 1995, remarked, racial differences become fixed in the public mind as deviancy from the norms of the culture, when, on the contrary, they are very much a part of it. P. 25. At a personal level, a white therapist treating a black patient the same as a white patient will fail to address his or her particular experiences of racism and miss the significance of the patient's personal issues. One patient, Anna, a black woman in her 20s, brought a pervasive feeling of shame about her body and her family to therapy that seemed to be sexual in origin. But although this was traced back to an experience of abuse at the hands of a male relative, it was complicated by feelings of being dirty, shameful, and sexualized, attributes that spoiled her sense of herself as a black woman, and that echoed the experiences of her mother, who was one of the first generation of immigrants to the United Kingdom from the Caribbean. Exploring the issues of sexual abuse outside this context was not enough, but her white therapist did not, at the time, make these links. Addressing race in supervision. These links need to be made, because if things cannot be spoken about they do not go away. Curry's, 1964a, p. 551, paper reported on the way that race bubbled along beneath the surface, leaking out in unexpected ways. He described a psychoanalytic group where numerous oblique references to blackness punctuated the interactions without the real issues being addressed. Siebel. 2007 b. p. 12. Also described the crooked ways in which race leaks out when it is not openly acknowledged in the therapeutic space. As does Thomas, 1995, who wrote of a patient who dreamt she had seen him in traditional African clothing wielding a spear and assegai, traditional Zulu short spear, as if nothing had moved on. Black therapists working with white patients report having their credentials and expertise implicitly or explicitly challenged and their ability to empathize with their white patients called into question. And, as Curry, 1964a, warns, this will be particularly difficult if the black therapist is unaware of or has internalized a sense of inferiority from the damaging racial hierarchy in society at large, because patients cannot help but detect these points of insecurity in the therapist and put him, sick, to painful tests around them. p. 553. These issues need to be made explicit in supervision for the sake of black therapists struggling with prejudice. One Asian trainee therapist had to spend most of a first session fielding challenges to her competence, qualifications, and credibility at the expense of extracting the usual history or fulfilling the expected tasks of engaging her white patient in the therapeutic alliance. In supervision, this was seen as a distraction when compared to a normal first session, whereas this trainee had of necessity worked on an agenda that her white colleagues would not have faced. The white supervisor did not specifically acknowledge the painfulness of this or name the origins of this antagonism, leaving the trainee feeling angry and as if she had done less well than her white colleagues when actually she had done more than they would ever have had to do. This might be even more apparent in those agencies that require a therapist to act from a position of authority. See Curry, 1964b, p. 133. Another young black therapist was seeking to engage a white man with intellectual disabilities in therapy at a time when he was feeling aggrieved about being unemployed. The patient became quite aggressive toward her, saying that he should have a job, not her, because he didn't come from some island somewhere. Although this was a difficult exchange, and one that was ducked by the therapist in the session, it paved the way for a discussion of race in supervision that proved to be supportive and empowering. While some white patients hold forth because of prejudice, others may hold back out of guilt, as one woman in Curry's group did by admonishing herself for being unable to tolerate her suffering, saying that she felt ashamed to face the therapist for, "You and your people have known true suffering." Curry, 1964a, p. 551. Curry named this as an overinflation of the therapist's tolerance for suffering, p. 551. Guilt is also a reaction that black therapists may have to field in the consulting room. And it puts them in a difficult, godlike position, as if they could grant or withhold an absolution that can only come about by the white patient taking responsibility and which is not dissolved by expressing shame. Heron, 2005. Argues for a complex self-awareness in relation to these issues as opposed to a knee-jerk reaction to disavow privilege because, for a white person, admitting one's privilege does not necessarily unsettle its operation, and may even confer additional benefits, which she names as double comfort, the comfort of demonstrating that one is critically aware, and the comfort of not needing to act to undo privilege. p. 344. Tuckwell, 2002, cited in Ride, 2009, p. 46, comments on the way that parallel processes of othering are often used as a means of denial when white people are confronted with, or challenged about, their whiteness. It is as if white people would rather focus on black group members, or intellectualize or think about gender or culture or seek refuge behind their friendships with individual black people than focus in on themselves and their advantaged position. Thus the tired old cliché, "Some of my best friends are black," just misses the point. The work of putting things right is more complex than simply paying lip service to anti-racism. We were moved by the way in which Krog, 1998, not only reported on the Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa but engaged with them and with what they meant for her own, Afrikaner, community as well as for the black victims who bore witness. For some this work will be expressed externally through economic or political campaigning, for others it will be inwardly directed and expressed in religious, meditative, or reflective activities. Swindle, a white theologian, wrote the following prayer after reading Griffin's, 1961, Black Like Me. Quietly and gratefully, Our Father, we pose before turning the page. We need to spend time reflecting on what we've just read. Don't just patch or tinker with our proud, prejudiced attitudes towards other people. Do a work of inner transformation. Refresh us with thoughts of forgiveness, acceptance, and the freedom of no longer being enslaved to the way we were taught or to how our parents may have lived their lives engulfed in prejudice. We pray this prayer with deliberate heart, deep surrender. Swindle, 2004, p. 153. And Ride, 2009, p. 50, describes a white awareness group in which participants move through a cycle of denial, shame, and guilt toward a more profound shift in beliefs and attitudes. Addressing race in the therapy room. Curry was writing mainly out of his own experience as a black therapist treating white patients because this configuration confounded the usual expectations of who usually needs and offers help and thereby forced the issue into the open. But racism is also there, like a sleeping lion in the corner of the therapy room. When those concerned are white therapists working with white patients may not recognize it there until too late, when they find they have been invited to collude with racist views or slurs on racial others. Taking the usual neutral stance draws them in further, seeming to support such views and leaving the therapist feeling uncomfortably implicated and exposed. But as Ride, 2009, remarks, it would be well outside social norms to draw attention to whiteness in this context, as if I would infringe a social code of conduct that could show me up as naive or on a wrong-headed campaign, p. 45. One white therapist found herself drawn in almost to the point of colluding with racist attitudes when working with John, a white working-class man in his 50s, who spent a lot of time making racist comments about his colleagues and insulting people who did not speak English as a first language. His remarks came from a contemptuous place in his mental life and mirrored needling criticism from his violent and dismissive father. For this relatively inexperienced therapist it was difficult to acknowledge but not collude with these criticisms. Gradually the patient registered that his remarks were not being endorsed, and he explained this in terms of her having to work with all sorts in this inner city hospital. This created a tension in the therapeutic alliance. The patient was positioning himself and his masculinity as under threat from less competent, as he saw it, others. Furthermore, there was a part of the therapist that wanted to collude because she feared that otherwise some of these violent undercurrents might be directed toward her. His fiction that the therapist only worked with black people because she had to was his way of fudging this conflict, but it left the therapist with lots to manage in the countertransference and difficulty in naming this dynamic. Emma, another white patient, living in the Northeast, came into therapy ostensibly to separate from her father, but she kept drawing him back into her life by entering into a series of casual relationships with black men, which she paraded before him. She put herself at risk by meeting these men in unsafe ways, acting rashly, lending money to partners she hardly knew, and taking risks with her sexual health. The white therapist became aware of the issues through the transference when she was left feeling very anxious and parental about a particularly high-risk encounter at the end of one session that had seemingly been forgotten by the next week. Confronting the racist paradigm underlying these liaisons was delicate. The issue was not that the relationships were across lines of race per se, but that Emma was using black men to say things to her, bullying, but, as she saw it, loser, father, on the assumption that he would tune into the myth of their sexual dangerousness. She hoped that at some level he would read her coded rejection of him in the fact that she chose partners who were not like him, while at the same time the relationships fostered an illusion of superiority that bolstered her own fragile self-esteem. Another white patient, Susan, quite explicitly used her black boyfriend as a bodyguard to threaten her father after a series of fights. Conversely, when a white therapist is working with a black client, naming their own whiteness in a nuanced way may allow the inequality of the relationship to be brought into awareness rather than papered over. Yasmin, a young woman in her first session in a public health setting, came to therapy wearing a headscarf but no veil. She had been living in the United Kingdom for 10 years, her mother having fled to escape domestic and racial violence in her country of origin. The therapist asked Yasmin if it might be difficult for her to speak to a white woman and wondered if their racial difference made it hard for her to bring important things into the therapy. Yasmin initially responded using a power-evasive discourse, saying that it did not make any difference and that white people could be kind or not, just as people in her own community could be helpful or not. Race was just about the color of your skin, she said. The therapist then persevered and said that although that was true, and that she agreed you could find kindness in all communities, it might make a difference that, as a white woman, she did not have to face day-to-day racism in the way that Yasmin might. Immediately Yasmin seemed relieved. She physically relaxed and said that, yes, she had in fact been assaulted only 2 weeks before, so that might be true. Later in the session they returned to this assault. Yasmin explained that she had been wearing a veil and a white youth had gotten off his bike as she was walking along the pavement and punched her in the face without any warning. She was pushed against a wall and fell to the ground, and an older white woman helped her up. As a result of this attack she decided that she would not wear the veil again because it drew attention to her. Instead, she would wear the scarf when she went out as a way of managing her own safety. God would judge her on her intentions, she said. But her partner disagreed with her, and this led to a lot of bullying at home. He was threatening to leave her if she would not wear the veil, calling her a whore, and telling her that she was trying to play the man in the relationship. As Speedy, 2008, remarks, "Our work as therapists commits us to a daily practice of multiple listening, a practice of listening to what is being said, to what is not being said, and to what is being referred and deferred to." It is within the gaps and cracks that exist between these different stories that the liminal or threshold spaces in the conversations, the points of entry to other sites and identity performances begin to appear. P32. It felt as if this material might not have been brought into the therapy if the gulf between the patient and the white therapist had not been explicitly acknowledged. Does therapy empower or disempower? If race goes unacknowledged when white therapists are consulted by black patients, they may end up seeming aloof and helpful in ways that pathologize rather than validate their patient's struggles and the many ways in which racism has structurally impacted on patients' sense of themselves and of others. Nadia, a young black woman, had lost her mother at the age of 14. Her family had been devastated, and, as the youngest in the family, Nadia had been referred for counseling to help her in her bereavement. But this period of personal vulnerability came back to haunt her when she later sought professional help for an unrelated and external issue related to institutional unfairness. Nadia had been taking a college course preparing her for entry into one of the top medical schools in the country and had been doing well until she challenged a lecturer who had been unacceptably angry to her in front of other students. Nadia had been 5 minutes late as a result of difficulties with public transport, and for this she was told off in this very public forum. Shortly afterward, a white student walked in, making the same excuse about the trains that was in his case accepted. In other words, he was given the benefit of the doubt that had been denied to Nadia. After the lecture, when everybody had left the room, Nadia challenged the lecturer for treating her unfairly. There followed a series of related and unrelated administrative errors. Nadia's portfolio that should have been submitted to the medical school went missing. She was then told that she had failed to hand in 2 assignments even though she had the receipts to prove that she had submitted them on time. These pieces of work were later marked arbitrarily and, despite the previously high marks Nadia had attained, she was given a grade that brought her below the threshold to be invited for an interview. For Nadia, things seemed to have changed from the moment she had dared to challenge the white man, Griffin, 1961, p. 9. She was despondent and would have given up her studies had it not been for the encouragement of her family, who assured her that she could continue via a different route and still go to medical school at a future date. But this setback represented a very significant loss to Nadia. And even though it occurred 8 years after the loss of her mother, it was as if her previous vulnerability was thrown back at her in terms of her being oversensitive and overreacting. This compounded rather than relieved her distress. She later said of the counselor, "The therapist did not get it, did he?" Sometimes linking current difficulties with previous losses is experienced as helpful and motivating, but for Nadia, the therapist's limited focus on her personal story had seemed to justify her unfair treatment by the university, to excuse it, to find reason for it. This says a lot about the potential for psychotherapy to obscure rather than validate racism and disadvantage. It might be that the white therapist was unconsciously colluding with his predominantly white academic colleagues, or that he had failed to take into account Nadia's view that things had gone wrong as a direct result of her explicit challenge to a white man about racism in the classroom. Perhaps he was not able to identify with Nadia because he had no experience of the impact of cumulative discrimination, perhaps he simply did not know. This speaks to a significant gap in our training as a profession. A preoccupation with Nadia's past had stopped this therapist hearing about her present anger and distress, because despite being a gifted student, she felt that her future had been jeopardized because she was a black woman. Jacobs. 2000. Helps us to think about the timing of such interventions and comments that it is not until race issues have been well attended to that we can be busy with another way of relating, quoted in Ride, 2009, p. 44, highlighting the way that these issues cannot be put aside while the focus is on something else because they literally color how those other issues are experienced. We can also see that much disadvantage comes about as a result of failing to give a person the benefit of the doubt or allowing them a reasonable margin of error, and the converse of this is that racial advantage can often be conferred by one white person giving it to another. As the white lecturer did to the white student in Nadia's class. For example, a white therapist in training did not report a white hospital doctor to his professional body even though a minor medical procedure performed on her had gone wrong. The doctor covered up his mistake as far as the hospital was concerned and politely apologized to the trainee in such a way that she would have felt it disloyal to bring the matter to the attention of the regulatory body. But, in the context of anti-racism training, this trainee did subsequently question whether she might have acted in the same way if the doctor concerned had been black instead of white.